Okay, we're on to part 3 of Kinsey, Crime and Consequences by Judith Reisman. And we are in the portion that describes him as a family man. It was Kinsey's interest in gall wasps that brought him and the only woman he has ever known to have dated, Clara Bracken McMiller, whom Kinsey called Mac. He's a chemistry major at Ohio State University and also an insect enthusiast. So, this is the only woman that they have reported that he has dated. When Clara reportedly considered another suitor and did not immediately accept his marriage proposal, he was profoundly disappointed and surprised when she did not say yes immediately of his offer of marriage, is what Pomeroy notes, which indicates narcissistic tendencies. So, you might be like, why? Why would you call it out like that? But the further that we go, the more you shall understand that. So, Clara was a talented woman, and she was garnered national honors for the chemistry paper and was elected to the honorary science club. Her father was a Fort Wayne high school teacher. Her mother graduated from Cincinnati College of Music. Basically, this was not a woman of little stature. She had some good foundational, education to stand on. So at a university picnic, unsatisfied with the campfire built by a colleague, Kinsey made his own fire elsewhere. Clara joined him, and that's where their courtship began. So, this is super interesting. The Alfred is described in detail to Clara his church work at Bethany Boys Club while he was at Harvard, which suggested to Clara that Kinsey was too churchy for her even. And then it gets kind of funny because Pomeroy insists to the contrary, that by age 26, Kinsey was a committed atheist. If so, he apparently hid that fact from Clara. So Christensen describes how Alfred Kinsey used the couple's honeymoon to test his wife's courage and stamina. He basically took her up a mountain and was ahead of her and then would wait for her to catch up. You'd establish some superiority over this whole situation. Kinsey, like it says, Kinsey would forge ahead and then wait for his bride to catch up. It was clearly a test of mettle, and she was equal to it. That is not cool. So he gets into the fact, why did he not opt for a traditional honeymoon? They did not even consummate their marriage on their honeymoon. So that tells you a few things, you know what I mean? So let's keep at it. This is Clara and Alfred. Biographer Jones confirmed that Kinsey did not, in fact, consummate their marriage during the honeymoon. Kinsey later confided to a friend that the problem was a result of inexperience and, physiology. Jones right. He claimed that Clara required minor surgery and that Victorian prudery was to blame for their sexual failure and the delay in seeking medical help. It's interesting. Until Jones describes Clara's complicity with Kinsey's homosexual life, she's okay with this. She knows about it, as well as his secret sex productions. Oh, Kinsey's, there's only little about her. She's in a dark suit, could be mistaken for a man most times. It doesn't really get into much about her because they don't focus on her. Alfred and Clara were married June 3rd. She gave birth to their first son in 1922. The child was diabetic and died at a young age. They had 3 other children, daughters Anne, Joan, and Bruce. Little is known about the Kinsey children. They were forbidden confirmation despite attending church, and they eventually gave their sex histories to Pomeroy, and their father, Jones, reports that Kinsey led his family on nudist vacations to the Smoky Mountains and that nudist magazines were pursued at home. Kinsey himself would often shave in the nude in the presence of the children. We are not told if this practice ended at all. So, surviving son Bruce has repeatedly refused interviews with anyone writing about his father. The daughters claim that their father was a typical middle-class dad who was thoughtful in all things. All the young Kinseys attended church. It's conceivable that Dr. Kinsey attended primarily to enhance the aura of It says all of the young Kinseys attended church. Both parents felt it was cultural experience they should have. It's conceivable that Dr. Kinsey attended primarily to enhance the aura of respectability. Earlier years, Jones reports that he had joined with the leaders of the eugenics movement whose devotees disdained the Judeo-Christian belief system, but a church-going image would provide useful cover for his secret life and unorthodox research. So that's a bummer, because that's not abnormal. We see that all the time. There are tons of pastors and people in religious groups that do, in fact, molest children under the guise of religion. So there's that. Here's a little bit more proof of that whole distinction, is that he was a militant atheist. How do we know this? Well, one day his son, Bruce, saw a flower and exclaimed, "Look, a pretty flower, Daddy. God made it." Kinsey could not let it pass. Now, Bruce, where did this flower really come from? From a seed. Bruce dutifully replied, apparently aware of the answer that would please his father. He knew this. There would be implication that if one believes in God, one cannot believe in seeds. A later incident while Kinsey was mentoring his sexology disciples further underscored his atheism. He and Pomeroy were talking about theological matters. Pomeroy, puzzled by the impression that Kinsey still entertained religious feelings, interjected, "I've known you a long time, and I have never heard you talk this way. Do you really believe in God?" Kinsey was irate and surprised that Pomeroy would have thought for an instant that he was a believer. "Don't be ridiculous. Of course not," he snapped. Another area that we know that Kinsey had definitely narcissistic tendencies was not only in the way that he responded to his child, but then also how he responded to Pomeroy, in that, of course, he is not a believer, but they do go to church. He also, according to Pomeroy, became atheist shortly after he prayed for divine intervention for a college friend, which we talked about in earlier posts, which was actually himself when he could not stop masturbating. Kinsey began to lose his beliefs as a college student, and when his study of science disclosed to him, he saw a basic incongruity between it and religion. So, having decided for himself he could not understand why every other scientist could not think as he did. At a certain point, he sought to avoid those who believed in God entirely because it was not congruent with what he thought, and he couldn't understand why. As he continues on, and I wouldn't say that this is weird because many of his members were carefully selected, and he did not want to choose people that were believers because they could not understand his way of thinking, because they were, clearly having a belief system of a different kind. Years later, his male and female volumes would blame religious-based ancient taboos for America's supposedly repressive sexual attitudes and resulting social disorders. So he is interesting because he derails truly in that this is not the way of science. This is not the way of sexuality, because he himself could not get out of the mind of it and had other perverse ideas. So he then would employ people who were not of a different belief. So it gets into the whole thing about Kinsey being fond of telling audiences that his institute's collection of obscenities is the largest in the world, except for the Vatican's. So following his death in 1956, people were they attempted at humor on the Kinsey Institute as far as its official propaganda, therefore passed down to journalists, not making sure that it is a real thing, they neglected to confirm it, quite literally. So E. Michael Jones, editor of Fidelity magazine, recalls this Associated Press news where they claim the story was true. What they don't do is they actually don't find the story. So it's absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense is what the Vatican then spokesman declares. So get this. If it's a lie, I don't know, man. But Jones then spoke to Stephanie Sanders, a representative of the Kinsey Institute, who claimed that the Vatican had been in the business of restricting those materials for Catholics for years. So they have archived these materials. Finally, Jones turns to Paul Gepard, one of Kinsey's researchers. This guy's a mega pedophile, in my opinion. Gepard himself had wondered about this collection of potential source of information. He, too, had been told by the Vatican that there was no such accumulation of pornography. Gepard then turned to the American Library Association, which merely repeated Kinsey's anti-Vatican line, eventually reported, and I cannot even, many years, okay, I just need to wait till the next video to quote this whole thing. So Gepard is interested in it because he wants to see all this pornography because he thinks that it exists, which it does. Many years before I joined the staff, somewhere about 1940 or so, old Dr. Robert Dickinson had just been at the Vatican and had visited Kinsey. At the same time, Kinsey had a bookcase about half full of porn, and Dickinson looked at it and said, "Gosh, you've got quite a collection. You've got almost as much as the Vatican." At that point, Kinsey started making these remarks. So, interesting. It was a memorable line, which Kinsey employed for the entertainment and propaganda purposes. It was bolstered as one of his favorite themes, that people who preach morality are hypocrites, secretly obsessed with sex. It was a fabrication, and Kinsey knew it to be such. But no one in the academia or pro-Kinsey expressed the proof. So, who knows if it's really real? He used it for propaganda purposes, and just because that one line was said. Although Gepard then says that the story is a myth, he also never takes steps forward to set the record straight, which is why we can be like, who knows? It seems like everybody has an agenda, you see. But ultimately, he liked to turn things on people that had a higher sense of morality, because he himself could not adhere to any sense of morality, which is what is happening throughout his entire life that is being indicated with his own words. So it is super interesting if you think about it that way. The next part we get into here is the Indiana University sexologist, and it's a lot about Boris, so it's not going to be pretty, for sure. So Chapter 2, Alfred Kinsey, he asked questions and analyzed their answers statistically in ways that implicitly assumed that all forms of sexual outlets are the same in meaning, value, emotional power, consequence, and everything else. Kinsey literally reduced all human sexuality to the single dimension of orgasmic outlet. In his behaviorist metaphysics, the number of outlets alone has any meaning. His revolutionary zeal knew no bounds. His casual pronouncement on animalism shows the monomaniacal zealot at work. That's Jack Douglas, the Rockford Institute. In 1987, that's his take on Kinsey's talking. I wouldn't want that kind of writing about me, you know what I mean? So in earlier videos, we refer to Mr. Man, who is Ralph Voris. He dies in 1940 in May. Despite requests from Voris's wife for a bedside visit, Kinsey is too deeply involved in his sex interviews to go and see him, as his dear friend is dying, you see. Under the cover of darkness, Kinsey entered Voris's office and removed certain items, including copies of original and their private correspondence. This accomplished, Kinsey and Clara returned to Bloomington without staying for... Oh my. Oh, he keeps a picture of Voris on his desk until he himself dies, which you'll be interested to know that wasn't any accident. So we get further into this, and the groundwork was laid for their eventual report on male sexuality. It's kind of about to get more and more disgusting, and there are parts that I don't want to read, that you might have to be responsible to read yourself, you see. What you have is the students of the Indiana University petitioned the administration for a course in human sexuality for students who were either engaged, married, or considering marriage. The university was well-respected, asked a well-respected professor of zoology, which ended up being Kinsey, of course. He was known for his exhaustive research on gall wasps, would provide a scholarly perspective to the sensitive subject. So few scientific data were available on human sexual behavior, and the little that did exist were distorted by personal bias or based on studies of a small number of clinical patients. So in 1938, it says that it is when it starts, but it'll backtrack a little bit and show us other things that have been done in earlier years that Kinsey himself will claim that he set out to fill a void with his own research, and that own research he considers to be back into his teenage years. So, which, like in early videos of the earlier readings, says that he was definitely not practicing on animals as much as we unfortunately thought he would be. Gross. So, it's a myth. Serendipitous sex researcher. Kinsey's mission was to strive for a greater understanding of the varieties of sexual expression and resulting in a greater tolerance of such variability. So, he gets into what he was writing to Ralph Forrest about, and thanking him for the benefit and exchanged experiences that they have had over the years. So they took this guy who is a pervert, clearly, as we learn about him. It was annoying that they were calling it Kinsey's course, this marriage, early sex ed kind of situation for adults was being called Kinsey's course. Other faculty members were confused about this, and Kinsey's biology sex segment was disproportionately lengthy and should be saying considerably less on the subject. Kinsey gave only glowing reports about the reception to the Rockefeller Foundation when requesting and receiving funds, because imagine this, the Rockefeller Foundation funded the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children that were molested because of this research of a pedophile. So crazy. Kinsey lists 350 intimate sexual questions to be asked to students behind closed doors. Which is wild, because it's a lot of questions to be able to come up with. But Kinsey merely substituted people for gall wasps. So there can be no doubt that Kinsey intended to use the marriage course to launch his major study of human sexual behavior. The interview he used had taken many months and quite possibly more than a year to structure. This was a guy who was very practiced, obviously, predictably elated in what he was gathering. So, reprising his early camping pattern with the Boy Scouts, he often accompanied his young charges on field excursions. So he is taking the biological information they received, Kinsey's moral and legal and ethical instruction, and flipping it into a course for people to behave by, which is wild. It is. They also got a hold of Kinsey's letters with Forrest. They did not resemble customary man-to-man correspondence. Okay, so Kinsey's neighbors were shocked to see him work in the garden clad only in brief loincloth that covered his bare essentials and nothing more. Kinsey's male bikini. His young daughter talks about his scant gardening attire and the impact it had on the neighbors. Yeah, that's pretty cute. No, it's not. He would go naked if we were on a campground. Kinsey's eagerness to talk about sex was more disconcerting. After several nights, rainwater discerned pattern. So a guy was following this whole situation, obviously. They would go hunting gall wasps. And after a certain amount of time, this guy's like, wait, there's a pattern to this guy's behavior. Let's hear it. See, I started reading this part prematurely. He would go naked in the campground, talking about, he didn't show any inhibitions about his bodily functions, right? So he starts talking about his eagerness to talk about sex. By sharing intimate details about his own private life, he would talk about his wife and what a good sex partner she was, and then he'd go from there. He had a pretty good wife, and apparently she was very accommodating, and they would talk to us about that, and then it would turn, and then he would ask us about their sex life. So it is instructive to compare a segment of Kinsey's letter describing his slim, bleach blonde hair, short tan shorts. The way that they are describing is Greek pederasty, like pederasty. Knowing what I do of the human animal, I cannot believe that the love and affection which older males bestow upon Greek boys and their aesthetic admiration for the bodies of Greek youth. It continues to talk about how it could have failed to arouse specific sexual responses, which found their outlet in overly sexually overt sexual relations. So they're reminiscent. They're talking like in a reminiscent way and manner of the scouting situations, the gorgeous males that they were talking about that they had collected over the years of scouting. Founder Sir Robert Baden-Powell's remarks on male nudes. It's putrid. It's super interesting. According to Pomeroy, Voris became the closest friend Kinsey ever had. Their friendship probably meant more to him than any other, and yet he couldn't be there while he was dying. He could only come and take away the things that would condemn him after he died, and his stuff would then be looked through. So that's a freaking bummer of a friend. They get into the whole thing about his standard in, let's say, hygiene standards. When a boy would not want to bathe in front of him on trips, he would send them back to the room. Like good boys, they would disrobe and take to the water. I reckon he missed 3 baths over 5 days. These boys did not want to bathe with him. And yet there is a whole area where he has written this dialogue. He was interested in more than hygiene. He was not just watching. He wasn't reluctant to just, he was part of this situation. Like, he joined in. It wasn't that he was just liking to antagonize younger boys. It's that he was with them doing these activities as well. He would put personal on these letters. So the first one his wife could see, his friend Voris his wife could see, and then after that it would be like big line, super big line of high, like caps, personal, so then he could read the last 4 pages by himself without his wife. He thinks it may have offended Voris's wife. Voris will be able to show the first part of the letter to his wife and read the last 4 pages privately, just like I said. Pomeroy did not expound upon the dynamite that Kinsey exploded, because Ralph Voris died tragically at the age of 38 in 1990. So I'm curious how he died, because when you learn about how Kinsey died from hurting himself from his genitalia, your brain will literally spin, because that's where it goes. It goes to kind of where we're allowing kids to go today, choosing their genders. Okay, so we go back. Berlin to Bloomington, Kinsey Institute, and the university contend to this day about when he started gathering information. They say 1938, others say no, it's got to be back further. If you look at the Purity movement, in 1919, Hirschfeld established the world's first institute for sexology in Berlin, organizing into 4 departments: sexual biology, sexual medicine, sexual sociology, sexual ethnology, and wrote 3 novels about life in Berlin at the same time, which staged the production of the movie Cabaret was drawn. Interesting. You've heard of the drag shows, the Cabaret, with the babies that go to them because they are pedophilic in its tendencies. This is Berlin is for boys, is what this view is. I don't like this part. I don't like it. I don't like this part. People don't understand when you normalize sexualized activities, like kids at drag shows, like, oh, it's not that bad, it's, it's just people dressed up and whatnot. It's like, no, you don't understand. Grooming is taking a little bit of something, and then you go a little bit further. So if you've normalized one behavior, you're going to pull back and be like, no, never mind, those men were shaking their butts in your face, and it's no big deal. But now, understand, including in The incongruity of respectable elegance in a dining hall while another chamber featured live exhibits. Live exhibits. Whips, chains, and other sexual torture instruments routinely used in therapy. So these were used by Hirschfeld's patients and Nazis and others. They note that he had advocated sex publicly between consenting individuals, including adult sex with older children. He also urged tolerance, quote unquote, and called American sexual hypocrites, terms later popularized by Kinsey in similar U.S. context. So what we are seeing today is living out exactly what has already happened. This is already history repeating itself, you guys. This is not new. This is not new at all. This is just like on crack because we have social media, and back then there was not social media. So you got these studies, the wise man of Berlin, as he was called, sitting on a silk-covered, gross. He had bloated lips and cunning, dimly coveting eyes, who offered me a fleshy hand and introduced himself as Dr. Hirschfeld. He's a scientific humanitarian, homosexual organization, German gay rights movement, the first to greet. This isn't good. This is history repeating itself. So it describes here that there is a man. He's got the deep voice. However, he was wearing women's clothes. A so-called transvestite, commented Dr. Hirschfeld, whose nickname was Aunt Magnesia, and introduced us. Then the most beautiful youth appeared. A hermaphrodite, said Hirschfeld. Why don't you come to me during my office hours tomorrow and you can see him naked then? This was an older gentleman in his 60s, by the way. He's reciting to a 16-year-old youth full of yearning. I realized I was in the middle of a brothel. This whole thing is a description of these drag shows with children in them. That's what it is. I don't know why people can't freaking see it. But it is. And it's gross. And it's wild. Because it's here. So Hirschfeld complains that the U.S. attitudes towards sex were not scientific. So he helps, he's hoping to lead an American sexual reform movement, but apparently the publicly acknowledged homosexual German sexologist did not fit the profile that the U.S. society would trust. So they got to find somebody that they can trust. Kinsey would eventually fit that void. So the sexual modernists, it just keeps going and going. Like, this picture is completely false. It talks about Victorian sexual oppression. It talks about Freud drew almost all of his major ideas from Ellis and other sexual researchers, from literature and philosophy. They're specialized journalists of sexual research and inconceivable sexual activity, preying against children. It literally outlines exactly what's happening today. It's wild. It's absurd. Public documents confirm that Kinsey's sex research actually began much earlier than 1938. The former Kinsey Institute librarian Cornelia Christensen, writing in the Kinsey biography, recalls a sexual lecture delivered by Kinsey in April 1935, 3 years before the call to become a marriage sexuality instructor, as summarized by Christensen. This is a strongly worded but thoughtful exposition of the influence of social institutions on sexual and reproductive behavior. It predated the marriage course by 3 years, and it provides convincing evidence that in his early interests in the concern for problems arising from the social restrictions on a man's biological nature. It talks about the ignorance of sexual structure and physiology, and the technique fundamental in the normal course of sexual activities, and the prudish aversion to adequate participation in one's activity in society, resulting in broken marriage. So he capitalizes on this stuff, you guys. Like, Kinsey's interest in sex and familiarity with the available research, he got from a gynecologist, 1,000 marriages. Kinsey arranged to have Dickinson visit Indiana University. According to Pomeroy, Dickinson was about to talk about a massive study he had made of the physiologic effects of masturbation on the sexual organs of women to be illustrated with slides showing shots of vulvas of his subjects. That means he was taking pictures of his subjects. He was a gynecologist. This guy was disgusting. Quite naturally, the lecture hall was jammed to the doors because you have a bunch of people that have been told that it... I'm just like shocked that this is a real thing. It was an original source of inspiration for Kinsey's own study. He was inspired by this. And it gets into Clarence Tripp, Kinsey's early sex photographer and colleague, explained during his 1998 British Yorkshire television interview with Dickinson that Kinsey's inspirational mentor in sex research had collaborated with a pedophile for several years and taught him how to record his child abuse in scientific detail. So when we get into that whole part, your brain's going to spin because he's methodical about it. It's not just like, oh yeah, hey, let me know what it's like abusing some kids. It's like stopwatches and it's like note taking, and he wanted to relive the abuses through children all over the place. So this is his groundwork that is being laid right here. And so then it gets to go to see, look at me, I can't even talk because I'm just like so stunned. Reading this in my head and making notes and stuff is one thing, but like getting it out of my mouth and being like, whoa, did I just say that, is disgusting. In 1973 doctoral dissertation, James Jones records Kinsey's assertion that he had been working on sexual studies since 1912 and 1913. Okay? While a teenager. Which means, what exactly do you think? Before it said 1935 was predated. Now we're going back to 1912. That would be during Kinsey's scouting, camping, and early masturbation counseling days. Joan further reports that in 1938, the response to complaints about the marriage course Kinsey had started... Kinsey stated first contact with sex instruction came 26 years ago. 26 years ago from 1938 is what? Well, it's exactly what it appears to be. 1912, just like we just said. So he says, my first contact with sex instruction came 26 years ago. I have watched it critically and contributed something to it in the secondary schools ever since. In 1935, Kinsey had claimed that men and women were not having sex early enough or often enough. Most of the social problems and sexual conflicts of youth are a result of the long frustrations in normal sexual activities. Biologically, delayed marriage is all wrong, is what he's saying. He is advocating for pedophilia when he is saying these things, just as he was before. So, Indiana University markets him as a free sex crusader, a disinterested scholar, attempts to say that he's disinterested in sex, although he's not, obviously. Kinsey did not reluctantly respond to this plea. He created the call through his lectures. So that's just a critical point to be made, is that he is advocating for himself to be one thing. Oh, I'm asexual. I have no, interest in sex. Although I have done all of these things that say I'm a predator, that say that I touch boys and make them bathe, and I walk around like a nudist, and so on and so forth. So Kinsey did a really good job on laying groundwork, becoming friends with faculty members and staff, in his membership in discussion groups and stuff. It was a way of letting a limited number of influential faculty members know what he was up to in a project filled with potential academic dangers. So when he went to the influential officers of Indiana University, Herman Wells is unmarried, still living with his mother, and enthusiastically approves proposals for anything from wasps to sex. So he accepts him to do the marriage course. Thanks for all the support which you have lent in the consummation of this program. I trust that history will justify its existence. And, he continues his sex research because people allow him to, enthusiastically even. This is important to note. is that careful scrutiny of pertinent segments of the three major Kinsey biographies confirms, so three different perspectives of this man, confirms that he maneuvered to secure the marriage course as a bridge to legitimizing university-supported sex travels, surveys, and experiments. I don't know if you need to, that needs to be any clearer, that there are things that people do to secure their position in legitimizing access to human beings for experimentation, even if they're children. People like this take an inch and then take it all.